Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Meeting the Challenges of a Global GHS. I'm Ed Rakowski, Editor-in-Chief of The Synergist, the magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank all listeners for attending today's event, and especially ChemWatch for sponsoring this webinar. Our presenter today is Claude Neri. Claude is the head of the Compliance and Research Department at ChemWatch. He has over 17 years experience in the chemicals management marketplace. His professional experience as a chemical database project technical manager and chemical safety projects manager includes the successful management of a wide variety of projects such as chemical database web applications, molecular modeling, and QSAR techniques. Claude holds BS degrees in environmental management of hazardous materials and mathematics and an MS in analytical chemistry. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Claude.
Thanks, Ed, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. I'll just also mention I have with me here Catalin Hegedish, who's a Senior Advisor, Regulatory Advisor here at ChemWatch, and has more than 7 years' experience with GHS classifications, and in particular with EU's REACH regulation.
Good morning to everyone.
So firstly, I'd like to mention a little bit about ChemWatch and who we are. We're an international company headquartered in Australia with offices throughout Europe, North America, Asia Pacific and the Middle East. We were founded back in 1989 and we have over 25 years experience in the industry of chemical management. We now employ more than 300 people globally. We're a large employer of science graduates and postgraduates. This includes chemists, toxicologists, OHS experts and hygienists, and we also employ a large group of IT specialists. We service over 5,000 clients globally across many sectors, including aerospace, hospital, research institutes, manufacturing and government departments. All of these companies use ChemWatch for chemicals management, SDS management, auditing, SDS authoring, as well as regulatory compliance solutions. So today we'll focus on issues surrounding or challenges surrounding GHS in the global market. The challenges will vary from SDS content, classification and other regulatory requirements. Finally, I'll go through some of the solutions we have come up with here at ChemWatch to assist our clients in producing a globally compliant SDS and labelling system. By the end of this webinar, I hope that you become more aware with some of these issues and also, more importantly, ways in which they can best be addressed and managed. So I want to start with a little bit about GHS in general. GHS is becoming an internationally used form of hazard communication framework for hazardous chemical products. It's used currently in the EU, US, China, Japan, Australia and many other countries. Each year more and more countries implement GHS into their local regulations, and by now it's a well-known system for most international companies working with hazardous chemicals. Since you're most likely already familiar with the main elements and ideas of GHS, we'd like to focus a little bit more on some of the details which you may not be aware of. We'd also like to point out some useful GHS information sources and international similarities and differences in the application of GHS globally. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll touch a little bit on the SDS in the EU and a brief explanation of what's required there. And finally, we'll look at some ways to best manage some of the issues we've discussed using some of the solutions ChemWatch has come up with. So a little bit of a history on GHS. Who published it? Well, it was first put on the agenda way back in 1992 at the United Nations Conference on Environmental Health and Development in Rio de Janeiro. After that, a good 10 years of work resulted in the first publication in 2003 by the UN ECE. Since then, there are new revisions every other year, and the latest revision was back in 2013, which was revision 5, and we're expecting another revision later this year. So the main question might be, why do they need to update GHS so regularly? And this is basically changes are based on experience and feedback from industry groups, and generally include a lot of practical updates to the system. I'm briefly going to go through some of the changes that occur from one revision to the next, as these sort of become important as we go through the presentation. Revision 1 added some new guidance categories for things like aspiration hazards and new chapters to give guidance on the preparation of SDS and application of precautionary statements. This revision was implemented in a couple of pilot countries. New Zealand was one of the first to do that. They did it under their HAZNO legislation, that's the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Regulation, which incidentally they've recently changed to EPA New Zealand. Japan was another early adopter of the GHS. For over a decade, New Zealand used a numbered hazard category system which aligned pretty closely to the dangerous goods system. That was created back in 2001. Since then, actually, New Zealand's in the process of adopting the standard H codes and phrases to harmonise their system more closely with our other jurisdictions. Revision 2 made some further updates, certain hazard categories, for example, sensitisers and explosives. There was some additional guidance on the interpretation of building block approach, which I'll talk a fair bit more about that a little bit later. I might mention that the original CLP document for Europe was based on this second revision in 2008. Going to revision 3, more subcategories are getting introduced, some more guidance on small packaging and labelling, and new hazard categories for hazards to the ozone layer. Again, on 4, there were some minor changes to precautionary statements. There were several omissions and some additions. I'll give you an example of what sort of thing happens here is, for example, in revision 3, precautionary statement 223 had the wording, keep away from any possible contact with water because of violent reaction and possible flash fire. In revision 4, this was simply changed with do not allow contact with water. In this case, it seemed that it was more practical for the labelling to have a shorter phrase. But these sorts of things become more important as we discuss some of the challenges a little bit later. Revision 5 further rationalised precautionary statements and introduced some more certain categories for skin corrosion irritation. As I mentioned before, later this year we're expecting another revision which looks to implement some new categories, desensitized explosives and pyrophoric gases, which incidentally I believe was adopted from one of OSHA's HNOC, or hazards not otherwise classified. Additional information to the safety data sheets is coming in the next revision, in particular section 9, and some new examples for small labels. So a quick look at this table on the right of this next slide. We can see that different countries follow different revisions of the GHS. You see that the USA, Canada and Australia and several others are working at revision 3 at the moment, and that China, Thailand, Japan and some of the others are there at revision 4. The EU, which is actually not shown in that table, originally adopted revision 2, like I mentioned, but have recently aligned to revision 4. Incidentally, this comes into force in a couple of weeks on June 1st. The GHS was designed so that each country could select their preferred endpoints and categories and cut-off values. Now, this is what is known as the building block approach, and I'm just going to go through a little bit about that approach and sort of what it means and the ramifications of it. So with respect to classification, the competent authority for a sector might determine whether or not it needs to address a particular endpoint, which is offered by the GHS. A simple example of this is that OSHA has decided not to address environmental toxicity in its framework. The competent authority should adopt the highest categories first when selecting from building blocks, and it should not or may not change the thresholds within any particular category. I suppose this helps some uniformity across the categories between the different jurisdictions and ensures that the thresholds are the same. So when using the same categories, people can know at least that the same rationales behind those categories. An example of what's happened here is with the UN model regulations, which previously had a flashpoint of 60.5 for the cutoff of their packing group 3. With UN model regulations revision 18, I believe, they've now moved that to be 60 degrees to be in line with the GHS. Another example of categories that may or may not be used is the acute toxicity categories provided by the GHS have 5 categories in total. However, if we look to the EU, and Australia have done the same thing here, that the threshold for category 4 being 2,000 milligrams per kilogram body weight for an LD50 aligned perfectly with the old system there. So in this case, they just decided to drop the category 5 off the end. Other possible changes and issues you get with the building block approach is that jurisdictions have a choice of certain categories, whether using things like category 2A for eye damage as opposed to 2, or skin sensitizer category 1 as opposed to 1A or 1B. So is this a problem that different countries are using different versions of GHS? Well, in short, it seems that the answer is yes. The problems include country-specific differences like different GHS revisions, already mentioned, building block differences that I've just mentioned, precautionary statements, which I mentioned earlier, and the changing of wording of those between one system to the next. As you can also see on the slide that I've mentioned that OSHA's adopted revision 3 as a starting point, and the other main market in the world, the EU, is at revision 4. So we can start to see already where some differences in the wording is required with respect to classification and SDS. All of these can cause compliance issues. So even though this is the case, the aim of the GHS was to provide a harmonized platform for communication. But at the state that it's in, can it really be harmonized? I mean, are these countries ready to use a global SDS and labeling system? The GHS allows us to all speak the same language, which is a great start, but the answer is still currently no, that there is still a bit of a lack of harmonization. Countries require to have their SDS aligned with local regulations also. Therefore, differences must be respected and applied when hazardous chemicals are used in multiple countries. There's some exemptions to this sort of thing between neighbouring countries like the USA and Canada. Australia and New Zealand have some exemptions as well. But on a whole, really, these differences must be respected. I'm now going to pass you on to Catalin, who will discuss a little bit further about some building block differences. If you want to take it, Kat.
Yes, thank you. Switch to the next slide, please. So here we put together a table where we pointed out main differences between jurisdictions implementing GHS, only focusing on big countries. I would like to mention this table could be a lot larger. We could mention building block differences between other countries like South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, New Zealand, Canada, Russia, Turkey, Singapore, and I could keep going. And then in this table, we only mentioned the hazard categories, which are different between different GHS applications, but there are also differences between the SDS formats. For example, in Europe, they have a strictly regulated template called REACH template, which all the companies must follow. In the USA, as you know, the 16 section format is implemented, but you're not mandated to provide any information between section 12 and 15. Also, it is a question whether keep using the NFPA diamond, and what happens if the NFPA diamond appears in a safety document for 4 years. Is it a problem? Is it a good additional information, or we should just stick with the local requirements? There were some concerns about using the NFPA diamond in GHS documents earlier because the numbering system follows different logics, but recently a new guidance was published where this issue was addressed. But at this point, we need to say one SDS does not fit all every country's requirements. And then we can go to the next slide, where we listed a few classification sources which we find really useful during our work. Just to go through quickly. The first one is Annex 6 of CRP from the European Union. Previous European regulations called DSD-DPD, which is the Dangerous Substances and Preparations Directive, included a list of chemicals with their classifications. This database contained over 4,000 entries relating to many thousands more chemicals and had been updated regularly. When CRP came into force in 2008, they took over this list and they used an updated GHS version for the entire database. This list is regularly updated by a yearly published ATP, which is regulated and published by the European Chemical Agency. The classifications listed in Annex 6 of CRP regulations are compulsory, but companies dealing with chemicals listed in this database are allowed to modify the classification as long as they use more serious hazard classifications or add additional, not yet listed hazard categories. In the database, you find information regarding hazard classification, signal words, GHS symbols, H codes, specific cutoff values, which is really important, and we will talk about it later on, and label-related information. The next on the list is the Japanese Chemical Risk Information Platform, where you can find links to several chemical databases, not only Japanese ones, but international ones as well. So this is a really useful platform for people trying to collect as much information regarding the chemicals as possible. In Japan, hazardous chemicals are regulated by several regulations and authorities, mainly based on the use of the chemical. For example, there is an Industrial Safety and Health Act, an Air and Water Pollution Control Law, Chemical Substances Control Law, and so on. And all these regulations may include lists of chemicals with the GHS classifications. You will find all that information on this platform. And the databases included in this platform can be inventories, hazard information, toxicity data, classification lists, and so on. One of the lists we often go to check is the GHS classification results by the Japanese government. This database includes over 3,000 records with GHS classification, and it is interesting to mention that in this database, the presentation of the information is different from Annex 6 of CRP, because here we will see all the hazard categories listed, and each hazard category is addressed with either the relevant category or a reason why there is no classification for the hazard category, which could say classification is not possible or not applicable for the chemical. And that applies for the statements and the signal words and the symbols as well. And they also list the reference documents or the reference information that they use for the classification. On this platform, you can also find SDSs and complete the hazard assessment reports. The next on the list is going to be the CCID database, which is the Chemical Classification and Information Database from New Zealand. Here you can also find toxicity and ecotoxicity information and classification data for the listed chemicals. And an interesting point here is that they not only list classification recommendations for pure chemicals, but for these chemicals included in different concentration mixtures as well, if the other mixtures are not hazardous. And they also mention the recommended HSR approval number, which is specifically required in New Zealand. We listed here the Korean GHS database as well, which is mandatory for companies to use in Korea, and this list is constantly updated and also includes the classification information. Below, you will see the CNR inventory and the REACH registration dossiers. These are not regulations, and they not include the compulsory information, but more like platforms where the European Chemical Agency collects information from companies and makes it publicly available for anyone who is interested. The CNL inventory includes every chemical presented on the European market. Therefore, for each chemical, you will see many different classifications depending on each company's understanding of the hazard of the chemical. The REACH dossiers are long extended documents including physical property, toxicity and ecotoxicity data, and classification information as well. The content of the dossiers are published by the European Chemical Agency without any modification and are available to the general public. It is important because the original scope of REACH was to achieve a broad and available knowledge of the chemicals being introduced on the market, and this is the way they're managing it. By the end of 2018, every company manufacturing or importing a chemical in the EU over 1 ton per year must register that chemical. So at the end of the REACH process, we will potentially have access to the available toxic information for all these chemicals. And then I would like to give back the slides to Claude.
Okay, thank you, Catalin. Okay, so based on the information you just heard there from Kat, there are several sources of GHS classifications, be it official or not. So one of the main issues we have here is that there seems to be a lack of harmonization between these. We've done an analysis of this, and you can see a Venn diagram there on the right. What we've found is that where chemicals were on all 4 of the classification lists that we've looked at here, which are actually the Korean list, the Japanese, New Zealand, and the European Annex 6, we've found as little as 8% agreement in classifications between common chemicals. I'll make this diagram available to the attendees after the meeting, after the webinar actually, because it might be a little bit small to read there. Just a couple of things to note here is that the Korean and Japanese lists are high on aquatic and environmental impact, as is New Zealand actually. And we've found also that there seems to be not a great deal of overlap in the substances that are on these lists between the European list and the Asian list. One more thing to mention, again, which is the CNL inventory, which Catalin mentioned. It's an interesting exercise in itself, as right now there's well over 3 million notifications to it so far for about 100,000 substances. And this is showing some huge variation in classifications of some substances. So it's giving a good indication of where the market's going with certain classifications. So the next question that really comes to mind is, who is right when there's all this disharmony? Well, here at ChemWatch, what we do with our SDS is we always default to a regulated classification for that country if one exists. Our EU SDS, for example, feature an eco summary in section 15 that gives you all these extra details. We've made an attempt to do a harmonisation on the C&L inventory classification by making two harmonisations, the most prevalent classification that is notified and also the most severe. We present these in section 16 of the SDS if the user wants to look at them for further consideration. Just a quick example here of a substance from C&L that has caused a little bit of issues. Talking about carbon black here, although most people are saying that carbon black is not classified, there's a good portion of people on the C&L who are notifying this as H351, carcinogen category 2. Now, I suppose as long as I have this information, I might want to adopt that classification to be on the safe side, or I might want to do further investigation or research into the evidence behind it. However, whatever the case, it's an important tool to stay aware of with the growing trends of classification. Our users actually can adopt the C&L position if they wish to do so, provided that substance doesn't have a mandated classification on Annex 6. So just moving on along a little bit more, we're going to start looking at the SDS itself and the differences in the different SDS templates. Most of you will have had experience with SDS for quite some time, and you'll probably remember how the US SDS itself has changed significantly. I remember a 9-section format some years ago that used to get around quite a bit. And so it's sort of moved to a 16-section format with the GHS. Prior to the HAZCOM 2012 regulation, the previous regulation didn't really specify a specific MSDS format. It simply stated some minimum information that had to be included. This regulation was dated back to 1994, and it, as I mentioned, didn't strictly define the format. So standards like ISO, ANSI, and NFPA standards were often used to comply with HAZCOM 1994 requirements. Thus, the SDS was never really standardised in a mandated way until now with the globally harmonised system introduced by HAZCOM 2012. I'm going to go back a long way now to when I was at university about 20 years ago. It was the first time I came across an SDS, and I needed to write one for one of my subjects. The interesting thing was the SDS we were to write back then, the main focus of the criteria was that it was to be no more than a 4-page document, clear, easy to understand information and advice for the non-practitioner layperson. As you'd all know, these days SDS documents are aimed at the technical reader, EHS professionals, toxicologists, hygienists, chemists, etc. It's easy to argue that they're not intended for the troops on the ground, and my advice to people is always to use a 1-page hazard summary or a risk assessment specific to tasks should be made available to workers. However, access to the SDS on request always should be available. So, why is an international GHS SDS still not possible? Well, let's take a look at a couple of the things we might need to check. So, is the SDS template regulated by the local authority? Is there a current version of GHS adopted? If not, is there an intention to do so? A transitional period may be enforced at the moment, at the time of sort of looking at that. What language does it need to be in? Malaysia, for example, requires SDS to be available in both English and Malay. So these are all questions that really need to be asked when looking at global SDS. There are certain other country-specific details to be included. Local regulatory references, for example. What are those required to be on the SDS? Hazard classification according to local GHS implementation. So you need to be aware of what revision any jurisdiction is at and what building blocks the jurisdiction took Like occupational exposure limits and available is something that we should all be fairly familiar with. Transport classifications relevant for local readers. For example, in Europe, you would have to include the ADN, which is for inland waterways, something you would not do in the USA. You would, of course, provide the relevant information from the DOT regulation. There are also other idiosyncrasies that come along with the various SDS, like special regulatory requirements by local authorities. These are things such as the WGK German Water Hazard Classification. Australian Poison Schedule must appear on Australian SDS. NFPA Diamond, although not mandated, is generally accepted in the United States. And New Zealand, for example, have this group standard and approvals numbers that must be addressed on their SDS. Looking at two particular templates, I mean, if I was to take the EU REACH template, it's compulsory to use this SDS template. It's a 16-heading template that generally follows the GHS structure. However, every subheading mandated must be included, it must be numbered, and it must be filled with data. Even if no data is available, then a reason for that must be included. The requirement of classifications in Section 3 for ingredients is also required on the REACH SDS. If you look at the same thing for the US SDS under HASCOM 2012, again, yes, you have a 16-section SDS. You don't have the requirement for the subsections or the numbering, nor is there a requirement to include subsections where they're irrelevant. Sections 12 to 15, again, are not enforced by OSHA. Extra statements, little idiosyncrasies like a statement regarding limited disclosure when you have hidden certain ingredients must appear on an OSHA SDS. Just one more look quickly, a Japan template is different again, requires some things in Section 3 and 15 that are very specific to Japan and Japanese regulations. So I'm going to go on to toxicity and ecotoxicity data now. And one of the many aims of the GHS was to use existing data and limit animal testing. Through the use of models like QSAR are encouraged. The OECD QSAR toolbox is used in ecotox to limit testing where data is not available, and reasonably reliable QSAR methods. I've listed a couple here, such as Ecotox TRA and the US EPA's EPI WIN suite. There will be a summary of all of these links actually available after the webinar, so you'll have a copy of all of those. Regarding experimental data, the use of similar data for similar tested chemicals, if relevant, i.e. bridging principles and read across. Approved test methods are given by the UN Manual of Test Criteria. So even with this standardization of toxicity testing, calculating hazard classification can still not always be straightforward and can also lead sometimes to some contradictions in the SDS or what might look like contradictions. An example with the USA SDS might be a material that's classified as a marine pollutant for sea transport, but environmental hazard categories are not implemented and may not appear on the SDS in Section 2. So you have this situation where Section 2 and Section 14 may be sort of showing contradicting classifications. So I'm going to pass you back to Kat now. He's further going to look at some of the intricacies of special concentration limits and cut-off limits adopted by various jurisdictions.
Thank you, Claude. As Claude mentioned earlier, GHS is trying to limit new animal testing and obviously human testing to be processed for the chemicals because we have many chemicals around us. They're trying to encourage calculations instead of animal testing. So one of the ways they do this using the acute toxicity estimate, the ATE value for acute toxicity hazard classification. This information is using the already available toxicity data, LD50, LC50, where we have them. And if we don't have them, it gives you a table with the estimate information that you can plug into a calculation and estimate the hazard of your mixture. We also listed here the specific concentration limits, which are used in mainly European regulations. These are concentration limits different from the GHS standard limits for certain chemicals. I have a few examples here for you. Because of the new calculation method or the use of the specific concentration limits, sometimes we see that the specific concentration limit increases the cutoff value for mixture classification, but in other cases it lowers the classification. So we found one example, boric acid, which is reproductive toxicity category 1. The standard cutoff in GHS is 0.1 or 0.3%, depending on the physical state of the chemical. But in Europe, in Annex 6, the specific cutoff value is 5.5, which is significantly higher than the usual standard cutoff. There is a similar significant difference for phosphoric acid, which is a skin corrosion category 1 chemical. The standard cutoff for this category would be 5, while in Annex 6, the specific cutoff limit is 25%, which is, you can see, a huge difference. The REACH dossiers can also provide the specific cutoff values, which is recommended to use for companies working with those chemicals. Another example where the GHS calculation method changed the classification for mixtures is amylobarbital, which in the previous system was acute toxicity category 4, and in the case of a mixture, it became the same hazard for the mixture at 25%. But if we use the actual toxic value, 250 milligram per kilogram for this chemical, the mixture has to be classified with the same hazard category at 12.5%, which is basically half of the previous cutoff value. We also mentioned here M factors, which is multiplying factors. This calculation method is used for environmental toxicity calculations. But what we're trying to point out here is that chemicals previously were not classified as hazardous can now become hazardous under GHS, which is very important to keep in your mind. Just really quickly about this slide. This is from GHS, and for example, the European classifications are also using this calculation method. The multiplying factors for environmental hazards are listed here. So as you can see, based on the available toxic data, LC50 or NOEC value, the more hazardous chemicals are considered with a higher significance in the mixture calculations, which hopefully will help the companies avoid proceeding with new testing. And you can get back to Claude, who is going to talk about exposure scenarios.
Thank you, Catalin. I'll be really quick on this slide because this is obviously something that's only required in Europe, but I thought it was worth just mentioning that the requirement is there. Exposure scenarios are part of what's called the ESDS, which is the extended SDS in Europe. It's essentially the section 17 of the SDS, or the appendix or annex to the SDS. In order to do them, you require some information, new types of information that not many of us have heard before the conception of use scenarios. and they are DNLs and PNECs. And I'll just quickly mention that a DNL is a derived no effect level. It usually begins life as a toxicity endpoint such as an NOAEL or an NOEC. It's then scaled to a human by a series of multiplying factors such as allometric scaling and interpolation between species. Orders of magnitude are generally applied for consumers as opposed to general workers. If you don't have that sort of tox data, you can use OELs to produce these endpoints. There's also methods of converting endpoints between different routes of exposure. The PNEC is the predicted no effect concentration. This is analogous to the DNL but with respect to tox data. And the third piece of this puzzle is the use descriptors. What ECA have done has essentially thought up of a whole bunch of uses which they feel generally covers all the uses possible with a chemical, and they've set them into groups like procedural categories, environmental categories, sectors of use, different product categories and articles. And what essentially happens is you have a DNL or a PNEC which tells you your no effect level of exposure for either a human or the environment. And then you use these use descriptors with some algorithms to prepare what would be the predicted exposure to either the environment or a human worker. From that, we just divide one by the other, and if it's greater than 1, we get what's called a risk categorization ratio of greater than 1. Any use with an RCR greater than 1 is inadvisable and the chemical should not be used in that way. Just quickly, who needs to provide one? So currently, anyone who requires to register a chemical in Europe, and that is at the moment those chemicals in the 10-ton or more category. By 2018, these will be any chemical at greater than 1 ton. There are implications for downstream users as well of your chemicals. If you have a downstream user that is using the chemical in a way that is not listed in the exposure scenario, there's a couple of things that might need to happen. They may need to communicate this back up the chain to you in order for you to include that on your exposure scenario, and you're obliged to do so. They may also cause your downstream user to prepare what's called a DUCSR, which is a downstream user chemical safety assessment. The last thing just to mention on this, that complex algorithms go into calculating these RCRs and these exposures. They take into account all sorts of things like the duration of the task, what LEV is present, or PPE such as respirator or gloves. And there's software out there that does this sort of thing, again, like the Ecotoxicity targeted risk assessment I mentioned earlier. Stoffen Manager, Risk of Derm is another one. Again, all of these links will be provided on a summary sheet available after the webinar. We should keep in mind that these tools are very conservative and they're only really validated for limited circumstances. So I just want to quickly now try and summarize some of the things we've gone over and ways in which we can get around this and ways which we've come up with at ChemWatch to help our clients deal with this sort of situation. So here at ChemWatch, we've produced a cloud-based authoring system called Authority. Authority was born out of software that we've used here internally for the past 20 years. We've done this in order to keep up with our own demand of authoring, where we author over 3,000 SDS per month for various clients. The rules engine itself contains more than 100,000 rules that help determine everything from decomposition products to the types of gloves and respirators that should be worn. This includes full phrasing of the SDS, chemical and functional group-specific statements such as isolation for the spraying of isocyanates and things like that. There is, of course, one more issue that we didn't touch on that much in the presentation, that is, of course, language and required language of the SDS. Authoring software like Authority generally has phrases, phrase libraries, and Authority itself can translate to 47 languages with a click of a button. Really, we're able to do all this because of the rules engine that we have. And as I mentioned before, this has been developed over 20 years. This same system has classifications for over 150,000 pure substances. A lot of these came from a lot of the sources that we mentioned earlier. Within our system, we allow you to take control and make decisions for yourself. However, the software will do everything for you. Actually, the main authoring form in our software is called Credeti Posteri, which is Latin for trust us. So the form allows you to simply input your name, ingredients, and physical properties, and at the click of a button, you can let the machine do everything. The phrasing itself can be edited in any way you want. Phrase sets can be uploaded with translations if you have your own phrases. The system's linked directly to our own regulatory repository within the Galleria Chemica database. It comes pre-integrated with Authority, and this allows the SDS to receive regulatory updates directly from the database as they're updated. Having our own database has several advantages. There's no need for any integration with third-party software or regulatory system providers. Since the two systems are intimately linked, we've been able to build a whole set of intricate workflow scenarios revolving around regulatory changes that may require one of your SDS to be reapproved or reviewed for republishing. This goes a little bit more down the chemicals management route. However, it does tie in significantly with SDS compliance. We discussed earlier also that several jurisdictions have their own idiosyncratic requirements regarding regulations. The WGK in German was a great example of this. It not only involves a calculation that must be made based on the intrinsic hazards of the chemicals, but also must make reference to particular chemical lists within the regulation that certain chemicals have pre-provided values. So having a direct link to a regulatory feed can help ensure that as the regulation changes, your SDS can change automatically. Obviously, it would require a review and a republish, but it gives you a chance to look at what further implications this might have to your business. So the real benefits of an authoring system really come down to language and regulatory compliance, as already discussed. Probably something I didn't stress earlier was the ease in which a full 16-section SDS can be written in as little time with very much ease. That is, of course, if you like it that way. The authoring process can be as complicated as you like, or you can just Credeti Posteri. Building blocks have all been accounted for. This means that if you write an SDS, a US SDS with H320 on it, and also has some evidence of a narcotic effect, switching this to an EU SDS automatically will omit your H320 as it's a part of the building block they didn't take. Also, it will give you an extra precautionary phrase, EU 066, which is vapors may cause dizziness and drowsiness. This is analogous to OSHA's HNOCs, or hazards not otherwise classified. Official classifications and SCLs also come into this a lot. Having the direct feeds into the program ensure that you get SCLs for the particular jurisdictions where they're available. I mean, there is a way you can do this manually and simply adopt them where they're more stringent than your own. But there are quite a few implications of doing this. You may not be able to compete in your own market where others are classifying it as less hazardous. Extra classification of substance can also lead to requiring further controls or reporting requirements, which at the end of the day cost dollars. So even though it's a compliant way, the best way really is to follow the SCLs in the jurisdictions that have them and omit them where it's not required. and just the last thing I'd like to mention is the SDS template itself. You know, there are significant differences between a lot of the templates. Software like Authority ensures that switching from one to the other just rearranges all the elements into the right spot. It will insert classifications for mixtures where they're required in the ingredients section. And it has specially formatted tables like that for the WGK that I mentioned earlier. That more or less brings us to the end of the presentation. So I'd like to thank AIHA and all of the attendees for your attention, and I think I'll pass it back to Ed now and open the floor to questions.
Okay, thank you, Claude, and thank you, Catalin. Looks like we have not quite 10 minutes for questions. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send to all panelists. The first question, Claude, is how do the issues you've discussed relate to label creation?
Okay. Most of the issues we have discussed are valid for label creation as well, purely because the labels themselves must follow the same building blocks, must have the classification according to the cutoffs and so forth that are required by that jurisdiction. The state of the label itself is a little bit less of a problem than it is for the SDS. There seems to be less variation. However, there are some idiosyncratic requirements between different labeling systems. But essentially, most of the issues we've talked here really apply to labels as well. Okay.
The next question is, looks like there's 3 questions here, so if you need me to read it back to you, just let me know, Claude. It begins, when it comes to chemicals that are deemed non-hazardous by GHS standards, does this material still carry a signal word, or do all chemicals and mixtures need a warning or danger designation? So in this case, does a non-hazardous material carry a warning signal word?
The answer is simply no. Signal words only required for hazardous substances. The signal word is driven by the hazard phrases that are derived for the mixture or for the substance. So certain hazard phrases invoke a warning. Other more perilous phrases invoke a danger signal word. But without a H phrase or a H code, you simply don't have a signal word.
Okay. Another question, what software does the hazard assessment that you were just discussing?
That is the authority software that we provide here at ChemWatch. The hazard assessment being the intrinsic hazards of the chemicals, and that is essentially generated by the ingredients of that chemical and the classifications they bring along with it, in conjunction with a lot of the things we talked about, like cutoff values, special concentration limits, etc. So the answer is yes, essentially.
Okay, here's a question from Catherine. What would you recommend for labeling in laboratories for mixtures?
Well, there's obviously regulations around that. We, I can only speak, I suppose, for what we do here at ChemWatch. We have a classification module within the main chemicals management system that's outside of the authoring. And that allows, especially in laboratories, you're doing a lot of solutions, preparing solutions of different concentrations and things like that. So this module allows you to simply input your ingredients, and you can use your own classifications or ours if you want. It uses the same classification engine we use in our main authoring system to give you a classification which will drive hazard statements, precautionary statements, signal words, and label elements. So for laboratories, really, the use of something like that is great because you're always, I suppose, making up solutions. So you might be making up a lot of standard solutions, but you might be making up a lot of one-off solutions here and there as well.
Okay.
I hope that answers.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just saying, if the question required to be more specific regarding regulations, be happy to go further on that at some time later.
Okay. Here's a question from Debbie, and it's a two-part question. How do you handle SDS preparation for dilute solutions? Do you have to provide information on the full-strength chemical?
Yes. Generally, yes. I'll say generally because earlier we mentioned the CCID database, that's the New Zealand one, and they've been quite good at actually looking at the pure chemical classification, but then also providing classifications for various strength mixtures. However, that can be a little bit dangerous because realistically, under the GHS, you need to look at the classification of the chemical going into the solution and then apply the cutoff concentrations or ATE formula or whatever it is to get that resultant classification. Now, that resultant classification may differ from what CCID is saying, so really best practice would be to get a classification you're happy with regarding the ingredients that to mixture, then use the rules of your jurisdiction in order to get that classification for the solution.
Okay. Here's a question from John. In the U.S., is the NFPA diamond required to be included on the product SDS? If so, what section is recommended for placement?
I believe it's not actually required. Section 2 is where you usually find it.
Yeah, so you can include it in section 15 or 16 as additional information. So it's not mandated, but it can be included because people used to see it in safety documents. A lot of customers of ours still prefer to keep it in the new format MSDS as well.
Actually, the vast majority of our American clients want to see it. So, and we put it in section 2, yes. I believe, yep.
Okay, and we are running out of time. I think this is going to be the last question from Chris. Chris writes, I work in a lab where we generate hundreds of samples on a daily basis, usually 50 milliliters or less. Is there a size volume minimum for containers which require a proper GHS label?
I believe the answer is yes, and I believe there's exemptions for all small packages like that. Off the top of my head, in the USA, I'm not sure where the limit is, if it's at 50 mil.
I'm fairly sure it's higher than 50 mil. It's usually 125 mil.
That's what I was thinking, yep.
But for labeling these small samples, there is like a special rule where you can only focus on the most important information. You don't need to include all the available hazard information for these samples, just basically the product name and the main hazard you are concerned about.
Okay, unfortunately we're out of time. My thanks to Claude Neri for his presentation, to ChemWatch for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our listeners today. Please be on the lookout for notices about upcoming Synergist webinars, and have a good day.